In the pre-dawn hours, a house catches fire in Wisconsin. Investigators determine that the blaze is a smokescreen designed to hide a more horrific act of violence. But the heat of the flames leaves the crime trail cold. In southern Florida, a series of fires becomes more than a coincidence. People are dying, and a community is frightened. Detectives must work quickly to calm fears and catch the killer before he strikes again. At a crime scene, everything is considered a potential clue. But a fire can destroy everything in its path, challenging forensic investigators at every turn and making each arson a trial by fire. In this episode, some of the names have been changed. "2:30 in the morning, November 25th, 1996. Most of La Crosse, Wisconsin slept. But one of its residents woke up to an alarming sight.
Your neighbor's house is on fire? What's the address there, please?
He noticed smoke pouring from his neighbor's house. Fire trucks raced to the scene, arriving moments later to find it consumed by flames. If anyone was home, firefighters feared they were trapped inside. La Crosse firefighter Dan Skiles knew he and his men had to get in quickly if they hoped to get anyone out alive. But there appeared to be no way in.
So instead of my normal routine of putting my shoulder into that door and pushing it open, I decided to sit down and use my legs to kick the door open.
Firefighter Skiles kicked open the door and discovered the floor of the kitchen completely destroyed by the fire. With no path to guide them, they relied on each other, making their way through the flames and looking for anyone who was trapped inside.
The person on the nozzle yelled out that he had a victim. We picked him up. I dragged him as far as I could before I ran out of air.
Despite their best efforts, firefighters pulled a man's lifeless body out of the burning rubble. It was the homeowner, 64-year-old Donald Harmasik. And firefighter Dan Skiles suspected something else was wrong.
There was blood on his head, and I thought that was unusual for a victim in a house fire to have any type of blood on him.
It was at that moment firefighters suspected they were dealing with something more than an accident. The body was transported to the morgue for autopsy. La Crosse, Wisconsin detectives Dave Schatzley and Carrie Jaholski interviewed the neighbor who phoned police. And although he saw the flames, he said he did not see or hear anything out of the ordinary. Once the fire department declared the house safe for entry, fire investigators went to work. Deputy Fire Marshal Gene Brink began the preliminary investigation to determine the fire's point of origin.
A fire investigator, in determining the cause of the fire, starts in the area of least damage, the outside of the house or the living room where there was no fire, and works back to the area of most damage.
The house was cluttered with books and magazines. Detectives opened them and found money hidden inside. But the victim's wallet was found empty on the table. As firefighters packed up, Fire Marshal Brink went down to the basement and inspected the debris, looking for some explanation for the blaze.
I want to show you why I'm convinced we had a set fire here. In our investigation, we determined that the fire had started in the basement. That's where the greatest burn had occurred. We found one area under the kitchen where the fire had burned on top of a pile of magazines. There was no heat-producing device in the area. We had a set fire at that one particular place. This was an arson.
La Crosse arson investigators checked the outside perimeter of the house. They needed to find out who started the fire and why. They noticed a broken basement window. Investigators believed whoever started the fire may have entered through that window. In the snow, one of them discovered an undisturbed shoe print leading away from the house. Since it was dark, he covered the print with a metal trash can in order to preserve this possible clue. The autopsy was performed at the Veterans Hospital in Madison, Wisconsin. The medical examiner found deep circular wounds in the victim's skull. The force of the blows caused severe hemorrhaging and trauma, rendering him unconscious and unable to escape the fire. Now, along with arson, authorities believed they were also investigating a murder.
Okay, everybody, we want to get a briefing in and get some job assignments.
Early
for
the next
case.
morning, at the La Crosse Police Department, investigators compared the information they gathered so far. Detective Joe Dunham was one of the lead investigators on the case.
The coroner thought it was a gunshot, but then he determined later it was a blunt instrument to the head that killed Mr. Harmachek. There's a footprint on the east side of the house in the snow.
Detectives also needed to follow up on the most promising clue so far, the footprint left in the back of the house. At the crime scene, technicians arrived to make a cast of the frozen shoe print. The snow's hardened crystalline structure captured the most intricate detail, but it had to be handled carefully so as not to destroy the print. Before a cast was attempted, the shoe print was photographed just in case. Hot sulfur, which solidifies on contact with the cold snow, was used as the casting medium. The sulfur hardens almost instantly, ensuring the snow does not melt before the cast is created. It recorded every groove and pattern of the shoe print. The newly formed cast was sent to the Wisconsin State Crime Lab. Inside the house, blood spatter stained the furniture and the surrounding floor. Forensic scientist Nick Stalkey reconstructed the fatal scenario.
The stains that were on the front of this chest of drawers were 2 to 6 millimeters in size. Those are indicative of stains that you would see at a beating or a stabbing.
He stretched pieces of string back from the blood spatter to determine the position of the victim at the moment of the attack.
By the point of convergence of the bloodstains, I was able to determine that Mr. Harmachek was beaten just in front of this chest of drawers. We did find a hammer that was in the area of these bloodstains.
The chest of drawers and the hammer were sent to the crime lab for analysis. A La Crosse police officer spoke with Shirley Otto, the victim's longtime companion.
So right now you can't think of anybody that would want to do any harm to him?
She and Donald Harmachek had been together for over 20 years.
No.
She told the officer they had a good relationship, that Donald was well-liked, and everyone called him by his nickname, Pops. Shirley also told the officer that Donald had been upset recently because his house had been repeatedly burglarized. La Crosse police detectives Joe Dunham and Brad Berkey looked into police reports and arrest records involving burglaries of the Harmasic residence. They found no shortage of names. It appeared perpetrators considered Donald Harmasic an easy mark.
He was someone that we knew kept money in his residence, and he had been targeted in the past by various burglars.
Police went to question a known local petty thief named Adam Tallbridge. But when he heard the police, he ran. Tallbridge looked like a promising suspect.
What is this all about?
Apparently running for a reason.
Back at the station, he denied any involvement with the Harmasic homicide. Tallbridge claimed he panicked when he heard the police. That is why he ran. He agreed to cooperate and allowed his tennis shoes to be tested. They were sent out for analysis to the state crime lab, where forensic scientist Jerry Kotajarvi was analyzing the footprint casts from the crime scene.
There are a lot of shoes that have the same size and tread design, but it's the unique characteristics that identifies that shoe to that impression. Like cuts and missing pieces and wear and so on.
He determined that the footwear worn at the scene was an Airwalk tennis shoe, the same type worn by Tallbridge. But when he compared the casts to the sneakers, he found the shoes were the wrong size. Adam Tallbridge was not their man. Then Kotajarvi discovered something unusual. There were actually two separate and distinct shoe prints, one on top of the other. He concluded they were now looking for two suspects, not one. Detective Berkey realized they had to rethink their investigation.
Detective Dunham and I both believed that there might be more to this. I mean, that information pointed us in the right direction.
Investigators still had no idea who killed Donald Harmasic, and they faced an even greater challenge. They were now looking for two suspects, and their hope was that the newly discovered shoe prints would lead them straight to the killers. 64-year-old Donald Harmasic was murdered and his house set on fire to cover up the crime. Investigators discovered they were now searching for two suspects, but so far the crime scene yielded a limited number of clues, and detectives Brad Berkey and Joe Dunham were frustrated.
When you burn a body, you take a lot of evidence with it, and also when you burn the home, you take a lot of evidence there. It was a challenge. We had a big challenge ahead of us because we had no suspects in this brutal murder.
At the crime lab, forensic scientists continued their investigation. Nick Stolke studied the victim's blood-spattered cabinet. Soot marks and spatter indicated that one of the drawers was partially open at the time of the murder. The chest of drawers provided Nick Stolke with important information.
The individual was beaten just in front of this chest of drawers, and then the drawers were repositioned, and then the fire started. It told us then that not only did the individuals beat the victim, but they also then ransacked that house after he was down and bleeding, and then started the fire and left.
Investigators now believe the perpetrator set the fire with the intent to cover up an even greater crime. At the Wisconsin State Crime Lab, forensic scientist Ken Olson tested debris from the burned house. He believed a flammable liquid was used to start the blaze.
It's very difficult to just take materials that are present to start a fire. But with an ignitable liquid, you can accelerate that fire and get it going faster.
Liquid accelerants leave traces behind that slowly evaporate. The debris collected was placed inside a can along with a carbon strip. Carbon absorbs any traces of the accelerant left behind. The can is sealed and then heated to 100 degrees Fahrenheit.
I then take that paint can with the charcoal strip inside, place it into the oven.
After heating for 16 hours, the carbon strip is then put into a gas chromatograph that analyzes the chemical components of the accelerant.
I take that vial and put it on the instrument, and it's automated, injects the solvent into the instrument, and I'm looking for any known accelerants that are there.
Every chemical has a unique molecular fingerprint. The chromatograph reveals that molecular structure.
I examined the residues that I recovered and found the residues of gasoline in 3 of the samples that were collected from the scene.
Investigators turned to the community, and they set up a Crime Solvers tip line. The leads began to pour in. One of the callers claimed a man named Todd Carpenter knew something about the murder. Detectives brought Carpenter in for questioning. He began to spell out his involvement, telling investigators he was contacted by 2 men.
He was approached by Nathan Lindell and Josh Lindell, and that he was a driver and they were just going there for a burglary.
According to Carpenter, the Lindell brothers heard a rumor that Donald Harmasic kept lots of cash in his house, and they wanted it.
What made you think that
The brothers offered Carpenter money to drive the getaway car. Carpenter told the detectives he stayed with the car while Nathaniel and Josh Lindell committed the burglary.
He waited outside while Josh and Nathan Lindell went inside the residence looking for money and rummaged around the basement and went upstairs looking for money. And at that time, they stumbled across Donald Harmachek.
Afterwards, the brothers instructed him to drive to the top of Granddad Bluff, a secluded spot overlooking the city of La Crosse. There, they built a fire and burned the clothes they had been wearing, including their shoes. Carpenter was surprised when Nathaniel told him the man inside the house was, quote, toast by now.
What's he doing? Tell him to come on, let's get out of here.
The brothers paid Carpenter his money. In total, they had stolen $300 from Harmasic. Carpenter said he got nervous when he heard about the murder on the news the next day. Detectives ran the Lindell brothers' names through the computer. Josh Lindell's record was clean, but Nathaniel had a rap sheet riddled with prior arrests, including burglary.
Okay, Marcus.
Investigators began to believe Carpenter, but they had no concrete evidence to back up his story. In the hopes of getting some, detectives convinced him to wear a wire. Maybe they could catch Nathaniel incriminating himself. Carpenter went to see Nathaniel.
Hey, Marcus, man, what's up? What's going on, man?
He told him the police were asking a lot of questions.
Hey, calm down. Hey, come in quick.
He said he was scared.
You want something?
He didn't know what to do or say.
No?
They've just been coming by my work, asking me all kinds of questions, about who I was with and who I hang
Nathaniel
out with.
played it cool. He indicated knowledge of the crime, but said nothing that could actually incriminate himself.
He was telling him to stay cool and just, don't tell him anything, and that those SOBs, they ain't gonna get nothing out of me.
They were convinced Nathaniel Lindell was the mastermind. But the wired conversation was no proof. Since Carpenter couldn't help them anymore, detectives hoped Josh Lindell could.
He did agree to speak with us, and that surprised me. His initial statement to us, he took the blame.
Detectives finally got the break they needed. But the extreme violence of the crime and their strongest piece of evidence, the shoe prints, pointed to two killers. Detectives knew they needed more if they were to catch them both. La Crosse, Wisconsin detectives were deep in the middle of the arson murder investigation of 64-year-old Donald Harmasic. The footprints found in the snow led investigators to two suspects, the Lindell brothers. Detectives Joe Dunham and Brad Berkey had placed Josh Lindell in custody. Although he claimed he acted alone, the detectives knew differently. Detective Brad Berkey hoped Josh would give up his brother.
I believed that he was involved, but I never expected him in the interview to tell us that he was the one that did this. I fully expected him to tell us that his brother was more involved than he was, and that surprised me. He was remorseful that he did this, felt bad about it, and he was trying to make some amends by telling us what he did.
Although Josh was taking the blame, in order to prove their case, detectives needed him to reveal his brother's involvement. Josh appeared nervous. He said he had never been in trouble with the law. And after hours of questioning, Josh Lindell finally admitted the whole story. He said he and Nathaniel broke in through the basement window, stepping on each other's footprints to obscure their tracks and to throw off police.
So we're gonna look for those.
They found Donald Harmasic asleep on the couch and panicked.
I was scared. It scared me, and I panicked and I hit him over the head.
Are you willing to speak with us in regard to this?
He said his brother Nathan also repeatedly struck the victim in the head with a hammer and left him for dead.
What's your present address?
Then they set the house on fire to cover up their crime. Josh's story matched Todd Carpenter's.
Exactly. Tell him to come on. Let's go.
He said they drove up to the bluff so he and his brother could burn their clothes and destroy evidence. Murder was never part of the plan. Although by the time they left, the plan had fallen apart.
Yeah, we weren't sure. I thought maybe we thought
After Josh's confession, investigators had what they needed to bring in Nathaniel for breaking and entering, arson, and the murder of Donald Harmasic. They arrested him at the apartment he shared with his roommate.
And place you in the squad car after he searches you. When we get down to the police station, then we'll discuss
He was
this at
handcuffed
that time.
and taken to the police station where he was booked. Detectives also came armed with a search warrant. They questioned Nathaniel's roommate and searched for evidence. Even though Josh said they burned the shoes they wore, investigators collected another pair at his apartment. At the state crime lab, the shoes confiscated from Nathaniel were determined to be Airwalks, the same style and tread design of the shoe print cast. Although not an exact match, the wear pattern was uniquely similar to those worn at the crime scene. Despite the evidence against him and the fact that both Todd Carpenter and his own brother Josh incriminated him, Nathaniel Lindell refused to talk.
He would not speak to us. That's his right, of course. But Nathan is cold-hearted, would do anything.
Based on the evidence, police determined that Nathaniel and Josh Lindell broke into Donald Harmasic's home, intending to burglarize it. Josh was surprised to find the homeowner asleep on the sofa. Harmasic began to stir. Josh panicked. Nathaniel then struck him with the hammer he'd used to break the basement window. beating him unconscious. On their way out, the brothers took the money from the victim's wallet. They set the house on fire to cover up the murder. They then carefully stepped in each other's footprints, hoping to fool the authorities. It didn't turn out that way.
I believe Josh was definitely part of the crime, but he was not the leader of the group. It was Nathan Lindell, his older brother, that was the leader.
On February 3rd, 1998, Nathaniel Lindell was convicted of first-degree murder, burglary, and arson. He was sentenced to life in prison. He will be eligible for parole in 50 years. His brother, Josh Lindell, was convicted of first-degree murder and sentenced to life. He will be eligible for parole in 25 years. In exchange for his testimony, Todd Carpenter was not charged. La Crosse homicide detectives narrowed in on one piece of forensic evidence, yielding 2 suspects who used arson to hide their crime. In Florida, authorities faced an ever-widening challenge as a string of similar fires became more than a coincidence. In the early morning of August 7th, 1993, in Spring Hill, Florida, the Hernando County Fire Department responded to a burning residence. Firefighters raced to the home of 80-year-old Becky Saunders. When they arrived, the flames had already ravaged a large portion of the house. The extreme heat was overwhelming, and the entrances were blocked. But the firefighters did all they could to rescue the elderly resident and salvage her home. It took hours, but the firefighters finally got the fire under control. Forensic specialist Gary Kimball investigated.
Due to the extensive nature of the fire, we ran into some problems. We were unable to examine a lot of the things that we would like to have examined because they just weren't there anymore.
The heat was so intense, any potential evidence was destroyed. Investigators were unable to identify an immediate cause. Firefighters could not save Becky Saunders, an elderly widow who lived alone. She died at the scene. Police interviewed Becky Saunders' neighbor. He told investigators she didn't smoke, but she often fell asleep with the TV and lights on. He mentioned a possible electrical problem. The house had been struck by lightning a month or 2 earlier. Perhaps it had caused some damage that led to the fire. All the neighbors knew Becky and were eager to talk about her. They said she was in good health and quite independent. Fire investigators asked if anyone saw anything unusual. No one did. The Hernando County Sheriff's Arson Unit, led by Detective Mike Owens, searched for answers. When they could not determine the fire's immediate cause, they needed to consider another possibility: arson.
Arson investigation is not an exact science. It's a big puzzle. You try to take charred remains and then put them back together. We take everything in the room out and try to reproduce the locations of the furniture, everything and anything that was in there, and try and see where you're having low burns, high burns, to see what area the fire actually traveled.
The debris collected from the house was sent to the lab for analysis. Arson expert Carl Chasteen looked for pore patterns or the residue of a flammable chemical, an accelerant, that would indicate arson.
What we're trying to determine is, has there been something added to this fire scene that would cause it to burn faster and hotter than it would if it were an accidental fire. That's what we're looking for. We're looking to see if there's been an accelerant added to the fire.
The photographs revealed a progression of the fire, which started in the bedroom. Investigators still needed to find out the cause of the fire. But with so much of the evidence destroyed, they knew it would not be easy.
In a crime laboratory, we have to be objective. It's not our job to convict somebody or exonerate anyone. It's our job to test the evidence and tell the truth. In this case, we looked at it as closely as we could, and we still could not determine that there was any ignitable liquid in the samples.
At the medical examiner's office, the victim's remains were autopsied. Though her blood showed elevated levels of carbon monoxide, indicating that she had inhaled smoke, Dr. Valerie Rao wasn't confident that it was enough to suffocate her. The poor condition of her remains made further analysis impossible.
Because the investigation really did not lead anywhere, it was decided by the medical examiner to call it undetermined.
Without any evidence to indicate otherwise, Becky Saunders' death remained a mystery. Investigators were left with unanswered questions. The firefighters in Hernando County would soon find themselves battling another blaze. But maybe this could provide some answers. An elderly Spring Hill, Florida resident, Becky Saunders, died trapped inside her burning house. Investigators were unable to determine the actual cause of the fire.
Fire rescue, what is your emergency?
10 days later, the Hernando County dispatcher received a call. Another house was on fire, and an elderly couple was trapped inside.
Wait, sir, they'll be right there.
Firefighters entered the smoke-filled house and saw a woman collapsed on the floor. They carefully carried her to safety. A man was trapped unconscious in the back of the house.
I've got a second victim.
The victims, Mr. and Mrs. Ted Burton, were an elderly couple in poor health. They were rushed to the hospital. Forensic supervisor Russ Knodel investigated.
Someone had broken into the home, had beaten the elderly lady. Her husband in the bedroom heard the commotion, came out. He was beaten, and then they attempted to set a drape on fire and left.
Investigators noticed a bystander engrossed by the rescue. Because entry was forced and the victims were beaten, detectives questioned everyone in the area, including the bystander. His name was Brian Searsley. He said he lived in the neighborhood and that he'd seen nothing suspicious. He agreed to let investigators swab his hands for the telltale signs of an accelerant. He also allowed them to take an article of clothing for further testing. The fire had gone out only moments after it had started. The arson dog was sent in, and investigators collected debris to test for accelerants. If an accelerant was used, detectives believed it might point them in the direction of a suspect.
There was some alcohol poured in a dish with a candle. The candle was lit and then put underneath the drapes, and the drapes caught on fire.
The rest of the house remained undamaged. It was searched thoroughly, looking for anything out of the ordinary. In the bathroom, investigators noticed a cabinet door open. Not sure what it could mean, the cabinet was dusted for prints. At the State Arson Lab, Brian Searsley's clothes, as well as the swabs and samples from the Burton house, were analyzed. Traces of gasoline were found on his clothes, but there was no evidence of gasoline at the crime scene. He was eliminated as a suspect. Police studied crime scene photographs, hoping to spot something they'd missed. Mrs. Burton suffered from Alzheimer's, and Mr. Burton had lapsed into a coma, so the couple was unable to aid investigators. They found no evidence that the similarities between the Burton fire and the Saunders fire was anything more than coincidence.
Right off the edge of the carport. Now, we know it wasn't a robbery because as we were going through the home, we opened up the drawer in the bedroom. And that's a picture of the drawer opened up in the bedroom. And if you'll notice, you can start to see a wallet, a man's wallet. When we picked up the wallet and opened it up, it had a lot of cash in it. So we know it wasn't a robbery.
With no known motive and no possible suspects, the evidence baffled investigators. Later that day, another fire was reported in a neighboring town.
Signal 4 radio. You have fire on the scene now.
We've received a call that there was a fire up in Brookridge. Again, the fire was hot and it had burnt severely to where everything in the bedroom had dropped onto the ground. We processed that scene looking for anything we could find.
Like the first victim, 70-year-old Monique Jenkins had been found burned beyond recognition on her bed. And like the last fire, a bathroom cabinet stood open. Once again, most of the evidence was destroyed. But investigators collected what they could from the smoldering debris. The body was burned beyond recognition. At autopsy, the medical examiner was unable to find the cause of death. The examiners did find the victim's hands were bound with duct tape, rendering her helpless. Examiners found no fingerprints on the tape. Again, there was no clear motive for the crime.
The detectives approach us and they're looking for anything they can find that will forensically link something or someone to these cases. They're wanting to know if we got fingerprints. They're wanting to know if we got any trace evidence, if we found any accelerants, or anything that they can put their hands on to help them in the direction they're going in this case. And at this particular time, we were not able to come up with anything. Very frustrating for the whole team.
Okay, folks, we're here today to review the facts that we've come up with thus far.
Detectives compared evidence gathered at the three fires, hoping to come up with something that would tie them together.
We had a great amount of intense heat inside this master bedroom.
It appears to be some type of home invasion at this point when both the victims were...
The intensity of the blaze indicated an accelerant was used to cover up another crime.
Once we examined the remains, it clearly showed that she had been duct taped with her hands clearly duct taped behind her back. So that's really the first indication that we're dealing with something other than accidental fires.
This was the crucial piece of evidence that began to link the arsons.
Because now we know we had a problem. We felt now we have somebody going around breaking in homes and burning these elderly women up.
Police followed through on several leads. None paid off. Worried, a man checked on his neighbor, Rita Talbot, after he hadn't seen her for a few days. Her front porch was littered with unread newspapers. She didn't answer the door. With the key she had given him, the neighbor entered the house.
Hello? Hello?
He found her in the bedroom, dead. Once again, police were called. They were all too familiar with this neighborhood. In fact, Rita Talbot lived on the same block as Becky Saunders, the first fire victim.
Scott?
Hey, Russ.
What do we got going?
Looks like another one. I haven't been in the scene yet, but we have, we're doing some processing out on the side of the house. We've got an open window, looks like it could be our point of entry. And
but this crime scene was different. The house did not catch fire. Detective Mike Owens noticed the stains around the bed.
What we've got is, looks like a pour pattern, Scott. Looks like we've got some alcohol bottles up there on the bed. And what they may have done, or might have been done here, is alcohol poured in the carpet, and not enough with this carpet to substantiate a burn, but it melted all the carpet down. Look at this pattern. Look how deep it is.
how about the bed? Did the bed get anything?
Looking at the bed. If you look over here, we don't have
The crime scene technicians dusted for fingerprints. This time, they found one. The print was lifted and sent to the lab for analysis. They collected samples of the carpet, hoping the fibers would yield clues. Cigarette butts and some empty alcohol bottles were recovered. After weeks of frustration, this tragic crime scene produced several key clues. Now, detectives hoped the forensic evidence would bring them closer to capturing the killer. For almost 2 months, detectives had been tracking a killer who was wreaking havoc on a peaceful Florida neighborhood. At the most recent crime scene, police found several clues, including a fingerprint they hoped would lead them to a suspect. Detective Scott Bierweiler believed the recovery of this evidence was crucial.
The past houses of the victims, of the deceased, had been burned. A lot of the evidence had been destroyed. We were not real successful in obtaining evidence. So we were all encouraged going into this house, knowing that it was most likely going to be tied with the other victims, same suspect in this. And if we were going to obtain any type of evidence, our best shot was to get it out of this particular house.
Fingerprints were also lifted from a vehicle parked in the latest victim's garage. At autopsy, it was revealed there were marks left by the duct tape used to tie her hands behind her back. She had been strangled. All but 2 of her ribs were broken and her neck was snapped. They also determined she was sexually assaulted. Inside her throat, the medical examiner found a single hair. As detectives gathered their evidence, news of the murder spread. Detective Tom Holly received an anonymous tip.
While I was finishing up my paperwork, I was working late last night, and I got this anonymous phone call from a female who tried to disguise her voice and kind of only whispered. But she said she knew who the killer was from Spring Hill, and she gave me the name of Edwin Caprat.
So we should have some good quality prints to compare with those of that, what is his name, Caprat, you said?
Caprat.
It's going to hinge on forensics at this point.
Forensic specialist Gary Kimball compared the prints recovered at the crime scene with those on file. Detectives learned Caprat had a long history of arrests.
Well, he does have a criminal history. He's a convicted felon out of Hillsborough County. And 91, we have a homicide, willful kill, first degree, robbery, and forgery from Tampa PD. And
they also learned Caprat performed odd jobs for several of the victims. One detective remembered interviewing him at the first crime scene. Kimball believed he was onto something. Forensic supervisor Russ Knodel examined the findings, looking for certain characteristics, such as identical loops and patterns. They were eager to share the news.
We got some good news. Gary Kimball just made 2 of your late cases off the Caprat case. Caprat is your man. He's the guy.
But since Caprat was a local handyman and worked for several of the victims, his prints could be easily explained.
car in the garage.
They needed more.
Wonderful. He's your man.
That's great. Scratch too. Daniel, another one, man?
For 2 weeks, Caprat was placed under 24-hour surveillance. Their goal was to collect more physical evidence. After he left a local bar, detectives took one of Caprat's cigarette butts, hoping to match his DNA to the saliva on the cigarettes recovered at the crime scene, and to the hair found lodged in the victim's throat. The DNA matched. It was the connection they needed. Detectives obtained an arrest warrant and went to the suspect's most recent residence. Michael Caprat was placed under arrest for the most recent arson murder of Rita Talbot. In a room lined with photos of the crime scenes and the many files police had collected, detectives questioned Caprat.
Prior to even interviewing, we knew that he was our guy, so we pushed forward with it. And Detective Douglas and myself kind of took on the good guy, bad guy detective.
At first, he denied everything. But when confronted with the evidence, he confessed.
Once we started our interview, we couldn't shut him up, basically. He just talked on and on and on and on.
During the 3-hour interview, he confessed to murders of 3 women, as well as the 4 arsons. Caprat was charged with 3 counts of murder, 2 counts of attempted murder, and 3 counts of rape.
The forensics evidence clinches the case for us, but there's nothing like a confession.
According to his confession, Michael Caprat chose elderly victims because he believed they were vulnerable. He broke into their homes and crept into their rooms. He would restrain his victims with duct tape, then proceed to rape and beat them. He poured rubbing alcohol that he took from their own bathrooms, spilling it on and around their beds. He then lit a match. For his crimes, Michael Caprat was sentenced to death. On April 19, 1995, he was killed by another death row inmate. Fire can be used as a powerful weapon. Killers who choose it know little is left in its wake.
Hey guys, how we doing?
Though some hope it will successfully hide their crimes, many perpetrators discover forensic evidence can survive long after the fire is out. And their trial by fire leads directly to justice. A family vacation turns tragic when a pleasure yacht catches fire near the islands of southern Alaska. As the fire rages, a mother and daughter are missing. When the wreckage surfaces, evidence suggests the blaze was no accident. In Alabama, a young single mother suddenly disappears and her child is left behind. As investigators look for signs of foul play, patterns of guilt emerge. When killers know their victims, they rely on their intimate knowledge to pull off the perfect crime. But even the best laid plans leave traces of forsaken trust. Nestled between the Tongass National Forest and the Pacific Ocean, Sitka, Alaska is a picturesque fishing town in the southeastern part of the state. Its 9,000 residents enjoy a tranquil life in the safe and quiet sea community, where crime is the last thing on their minds.
Air Station Sitka, Arson speaking, help you.
On June 4th, 1996, business owner Robert Meyer called the U.S. Coast Guard to report an accident. His 50-foot pleasure yacht had caught fire. His wife and daughter were missing.
Now, get the Ready Helo online, get the Ready Helo online.
Within minutes, a search and rescue operation was launched. The yacht was completely engulfed in flames, and it was sinking. Even in June, the Alaskan waters are cold. Rescue workers needed to act quickly if they hoped to rescue Diana and Chrissy Meyer. Coast Guard officials in Juneau notified the Sitka Police Department about the accident and that the mother and daughter were missing. Sergeant Darrell Rice went to the Meyer residence in the hopes of gathering any information to aid in the rescue efforts. Robert Meyer had returned home soon after he had phoned the Coast Guard. He was exhausted and distraught. He told the officer he had taken his family on a cruise around the islands just north of town. They left 2 days earlier. It was supposed to be their last outing together before his daughter Chrissy went away to college. Sergeant Rice asked about the trip.
He responded that this was the most perfect weekend and it couldn't have been any better. We were having a great time.
Meyer said that sometime around daybreak he smelled smoke coming from the console, and that the floor above the engine room felt hot. Thinking the boat was on fire, Meyer said he rushed to get his family onto the small skiff and safely away from the flames. Realizing the family dog was still inside, Chrissy begged him to go back and rescue her.
Hey, Daisy, come here. Daisy! Daisy, come on. Daisy!
When he came back, his wife and daughter were gone.
Chrissy! Diana! Chrissy! Diana!
Meyer went on to say there were 2 to 3 foot swells in the waters. He believed his wife and daughter fell trying to get into the skiff. Sergeant Rice asked him if he needed medical attention. Meyer said that he had noticed a scrape on his leg. He must have gotten it as he left the boat. The search for the missing women continued. Search and Rescue Captain Don Cluting organized members from the Sitka Fire Department.
We had actually lots of coverage. We had air coverage provided by the Coast Guard. We had water coverage provided by the Sitka Fire Department search and rescue teams, as well as private boats in the area.
They followed the current, searching the water and shore for any sign of Diana or Chrissy. But with each passing hour, the rescue workers grew more concerned.
If you guys can go ahead and head east, conduct a shoreline search on up towards the inlet up here. Cover the shore fairly good. We need to get a. We're calling out. We're using attraction as well as looking. The number one goal was, to locate Diana and Chrissy Myers, which is always what our number one goal is. We were in, search and rescue mode. We were doing a Type 2 search, which is, fairly thorough. We're looking for, any types of evidence, things like that, as well as people on the beach.
Hey, John. Look right over there in that little bite. Something over there.
The rescue workers spotted a red object floating in the water. They retrieved the empty gasoline container. They noticed its cap was missing. The search continued for hours. But by mid-afternoon, rescue workers were running out of options.
We've searched the beaches around the vicinity where the boat sank. We also conducted shoreline searches, from the boat. We covered and recovered the areas over and over again. We totally exhausted the search areas.
The search for Diana and Chrissy Meyer lasted for over 24 hours. The rescue mission was now a recovery operation.
The determination was made to, suspend the mission pending further developments.
Authorities continued to comb the shores, but now they were searching for bodies. They were also searching for wreckage of the burned yacht, most of which was now at the bottom of the ocean. Alaska State Trooper Randy McFerrin was called from Ketchikan to lead an investigation looking into the fatal accident. At a briefing, McFerrin viewed a tape of the burning yacht supplied by the Coast Guard. According to Robert Meyer, there were 3-foot swells in the water when his wife and daughter were going from the yacht onto the skiff. But in the video, the water appeared calm.
Box it, the waves are 3 to 5 foot. As you can see here in the video, the seas are relatively calm.
Okay. Sounds like he took off from Sitka on Sunday.
He was also briefed on Meyer's weekend route the day before the fire. Instead of taking a safer, more inland route, Meyer took his family out into rougher seas.
Peninsula, which, long route and a lot of open water out here, rough waters.
So why would somebody go out here where it's rough when you can come through here when it's nice and smooth?
Don't know. Okay. That's a question.
Okay.
As the other officers brought him up to speed regarding the investigation, McFerrin noticed some inconsistencies in Robert Meyer's statements. Before they could proceed, a full set of transcripts of all interviews were ordered for comparison. Sergeant Darrell Rice went back to Robert Meyer's house, hoping he could shed some light onto how and why the fire started. Since Meyer had told him he was the first one to smell smoke, Sergeant Rice asked to see his clothes. He was looking for some clue as to the fire's origin.
We were invited in the kitchen, and there was a room adjacent to it, a little laundry room that had his clothing in it, inside of a wash machine, and they reeked of diesel fumes.
Meyer explained that after he discovered the fire, he ran directly to the engine room, where he got some fuel on his clothes. The officer also asked to examine the 24-foot skiff. The boat was retrieved from the beach near Myers Marina and taken to a Coast Guard hangar. At the State Crime Lab, criminalist Walter McFarlane examined the clothing. He used ultraviolet light to detect evidence of hair or fibers, but found nothing significant.
There was quite an odor of an accelerant or fuel present, and our main objective at that time was to get them into containers and protected to save that type of evidence.
The clothing was preserved until they could be examined for the presence of accelerants or solvents. Sergeant Randy McFerrin and Darrell Rice combed through the transcripts, uncovering several inconsistencies in Meyer's statements.
In one interview, he described how the electricity went out, then one engine, then another engine, and then he felt fire below decks. In another interview, he said the engine stopped and then the electricity went out. In one interview, he said his wife and daughter were asleep when the boat broke down. In another interviews, he said...
The next day, McFerrin hoped to clear up some of the discrepancies by speaking to Meyer personally.
About Meyer?
Yeah.
Hi, I'm Sergeant McFerrin of the State Troopers.
Yeah.
Wonder if you got a minute to talk to me about...
But Meyer suddenly would not cooperate and wouldn't talk to the investigator.
He refused to speak to us unless his attorney was present, and we agreed to do that. Later that afternoon, we did a short interview, about half an hour long, with him with the attorney present before the attorney terminated the interview and told us to leave.
Without further cooperation from Meyer, investigators turned to an examination of his boat. Meyer's 24-foot Carolina skiff was photographed and examined for possible damage, trace evidence, and blood stains. Just beneath the windshield on the cabin, he noticed a small red-colored stain. The stain was swabbed, and a presumptive blood test was performed. The sample tested positive. They found blood. Preliminary forensic tests revealed the blood was of human origin. Now they needed to find out whose blood it was. Investigators were puzzled. They had 2 missing women and nothing more. And although there was very little evidence suggesting this was anything other than an accident, the only person who might supply answers now refused to talk. The only other place to look was on the yacht, and that was at the bottom of the ocean. Investigators in Sitka, Alaska began to suspect foul play in a boating accident. Diana and Chrissy Meyer were presumed dead. But they had no bodies and little forensic evidence. Businessman Robert Meyer still refused to speak with police or help in the investigation into the disappearance of his wife and daughter. Efforts to locate and extract the sunken yacht also met with repeated obstacles. While the sunken boat was initially thought to have landed on a ledge, divers and underwater cameras failed to locate the bulk of the wreckage. The boat was missing. The news of the accident spread through the small town of Sitka. If Robert Myers wouldn't talk to police, they soon discovered many would. At the Sitka police station, tips and additional information started to come in.
There's a life insurance policy on Meyer's wife and daughter you asked for.
Okay, I gotta go.
2 days after the fire, lead investigator Randy McFerrin learned of insurance policies Meyer had taken out on his wife and daughter. They were for $500,000 each.
Again, it's kind of suspicious. You know, number one, why would you insure a teenager for $500,000? I mean, she's not a wage earner. They're dead, and now you're looking at getting $1 million.
Meyer also had complete replacement insurance on his 50-foot yacht, listed on the policy as a Hatteras, a boat worth $250,000. McFerrin needed to learn as much as possible about the Meyer family.
Could you tell me what her relationship was like with her parents?
It seemed fine. She was really tight with her mother.
One of Chrissy's friends told him that she was not aware of any family problems, and that to her knowledge, the Meyer family was close, especially Chrissy and her mother.
Do you know if Christine could swim at all?
Yeah, we have to take a test.
When asked if Chrissy was a good swimmer, she said that Chrissy had taken lessons in school.
And if you think of anything more, please give me a call, okay?
Contrary to Meyer's claim, his daughter not only could swim, but she completed an advanced course.
Like Christine could swim after all. This is a certificate from the school.
McFerrin then spoke with a seasonal employee from Meyer's business. The employee said that Robert Meyer was acting strange in the days following Diana and Chrissy's disappearance. He didn't appear to be upset, and he had little input into his family's arrangements.
Nor Anne have done anything to prepare for the upcoming memorial service.
She commented that Meyer had a short temper and would often snap and yell at employees. She had seen him fire and rehire employees several times in the 4 summers she worked for him. There were rumors of an affair between Meyer and one of his employees. A neighbor told the investigator she saw an employee come over to Meyer's residence several times when Diana and Chrissy were out of town. She said the woman would often stay until morning. Another curious piece of information came from a repairman who regularly worked on Meyer's yacht.
How are you today? I'm pretty good. You got a minute to talk to me?
The repairman told the investigator that the yacht was not a Hatteras like Myers claimed, but a less expensive look-alike Meridian yacht, difficult to tell apart. And it was not in the best condition.
This is the initial survey.
With rumors of an affair and indications of possible insurance fraud, circumstantial evidence surrounding Robert Meyer was mounting quickly. But without anything concrete, investigators knew it would be difficult to prove their case. They believed the forensic evidence they needed was buried deep within the submerged wreckage. 2 weeks after the fatal fire, Meyer's clothing and the empty gas can were analyzed at the State Crime Lab in Anchorage. Criminalist Chris Boeheim tested the clothing by attaching a small strip of activated charcoal on the lid of each can. The charcoal would absorb any ignitable liquid. The cans were then placed into an oven and heated to speed up the process. Once that was complete, Boeheim used a gas chromatograph mass spectrometer to separate the components and break down the complex mixtures. Petroleum distillates make a bell-shaped graph which can be read and analyzed. Boeheim concluded that the solvent in the empty gas can discovered at the site of the fire was the same as that found on Meyer's clothing.
There were 5 clothing items present in this case, and 4 of the items I detected the presence of fuel oil, something similar to kerosene or a diesel fuel. The petroleum products that I detected in the Meyer case were all heavier in nature, not as volatile as, say, gasoline or lighter fluid, so they would tend to stay around longer and not evaporate as fast.
On the surface, evidence was beginning to stack up against Robert Meyer. But investigators believed the strongest physical evidence still remained hidden somewhere at the bottom of the ocean. Unless the wreckage could be found and recovered, investigators knew there was little chance of ever proving their case. Detectives in Sitka, Alaska struggled to discover the truth behind a deadly fire that appeared to have claimed the lives of 2 women. Circumstantial evidence suggested foul play, and Robert Meyer was emerging as a suspect. Failed attempts to locate the burned yacht left investigators without solid physical proof. And the small town of Sitka did not have the resources necessary for a successful recovery. 2 months after the investigation began, State Trooper Randy McFerrin received a fax from Alaska Fish and Game Authority.
We had found out a mini-sub was going to be in the area doing some research work, and we got a hold of them and asked them if they could work us in for a day, and they did.
After an hour of searching the murky waters at a depth of 500 feet, McFerrin found what he was looking for. The superstructure and main deck had been totally consumed by the fire. But the engine room and a majority of the swim step appeared intact. try to salvage the wreckage, McFerrin contacted the Bureau of Alcohol, Tobacco, and Firearms and enlisted the services of certified fire investigator George Barnes. Based on footage taken from the submarine, Barnes concluded that the best and perhaps only chance at salvaging the boat would be to try to bring it up by its 2 diesel engines. But they needed to wait until the early spring. The salvage operation was too difficult to attempt during an Alaskan winter. The operation was planned for March the following year. Using a crane barge from a company in Sitka and a remotely operated vehicle supplied by the U.S. Navy, wreckage from Meyer's boat began to surface. Extensive corrosion and water damage had taken a toll on the yacht.
The boat was so badly damaged we couldn't pick it up off the bottom. There was just nothing hard to grab onto. It was kind of like picking up a stick of warm butter.
George Barnes was right about the engines. The salvage crew had something to grab onto, making lifting easier. And contrary to Meyer's theory, the engines were intact.
His story was that the fire started as an engine room fire and progressed to eventually involve the whole vessel. When we recovered the engines, we noted that there was still paint in considerable amounts on the engines. We also noted that there was also some hose attached to the hose connections and insulation on electrical wiring that was recovered. Based on those observations, we concluded that the fire could not have started in the engine room as Mr. Meyer had alleged.
Investigator Barnes examined 3 pieces of a swim step that were recovered. He believed they would prove his theory that the fire started someplace other than the engine room. The wood appeared to be teak and had irregular burn patterns.
The right, or the starboard side of the swim step, was severely damaged by fire, and the area nearest the vessel was severely damaged by fire, but the vessel itself was not damaged in that same area.
If he was correct and the wood was teak, Barnes knew it would have been difficult to burn. If the fire had started in the engine room, the distance between it and the swim step made the severe burn patterns found on the wood virtually impossible. Because teak wood burns so slowly, by the time the fire reached the swim step would have been submerged and the damage would be minimal. Randy McFerrin had the wood tested to determine its type.
Hi, George, it's Randy.
Barnes was right. The wood was teak.
The lab report's back.
To test his theory, George Barnes performed an experiment. Not only was the wood difficult to burn as he suspected, but the location of Meyer's swim step was only 6 inches above water in calm conditions.
Mr. Myers had claimed that the seas were 3 to 4 feet at the time of the fire, and we found it rather surprising, if not impossible, for the swim step to have exhibited this type of fire damage when it's constantly being dunked in seawater during these swells.
Investigators also knew that without bodies, it would be difficult to determine the truth about the women's death. At the State Crime Lab in Anchorage, Hayne Hamilton tried to extract DNA from a tiny blood stain found on Meyer's skiff. To do this, the scientists tried a new technology at the time called polymerase chain reaction, or PCR.
The former DNA analysis required as much stain as the size of a quarter. The newer PCR, or polymerase chain reaction, that we utilized required as little as the dot at the end of a sentence.
The sample is mixed with chemicals and heated, then cooled in an instrument to break down, separate, and copy the DNA double helices. After 32 cycles of heating and cooling, the chain reaction of the new and copied DNA multiplied from a few to billions. all with unique genetic markings. Once the process was completed, Hamilton compared genetic markings and was able to conclude that the blood could not have belonged to Robert Meyer or his daughter. But investigators had no way of getting a blood sample from his wife, Diana. Using blood supplied by her biological parents, Hamilton was able to perform a reverse paternity test. The probability that the blood on the skiff was Diana's was over 99%.
In one of his early statements, Bob Meyer said that if any blood was on the skiff, it would have been his. He claimed that he cut himself boarding the skiff it had an external gas tank, and he cut his leg, and that blood would have been his.
McFerrin believed this was the evidence he needed to arrest Robert Meyer. Although the bodies had not been recovered, investigators now believe that Meyer had murdered his wife and daughter sometime during their weekend together. He then doused his yacht with gasoline and deliberately set it on fire to make it look like an accident. But days before Robert Meyer was due before a grand jury, he was suddenly injured in a car accident.
He broke his neck and was paralyzed from the neck down. When this occurred, we were making plans to take this case to the grand jury here in Sitka, and so basically put everything on hold. We're just waiting to see if he was going to survive from his injuries or not.
He did survive. He returned to Sitka to face the hearing, confined to a wheelchair. The grand jury handed down indictments, charging Meyer with 2 counts of murder in the first degree, 2 counts of murder in the second degree, arson, tampering with physical evidence, and 2 counts of scheme to defraud. But Meyer would never face a criminal trial. A few months before he was to appear in court, Robert Meyer's body was discovered in shallow water off the end of a dock. After a thorough investigation, investigators concluded he had taken his own life. Robert Meyer planned and successfully executed the murders of his wife and daughter. But in the end, submerged forensic evidence proved his guilt. In Alabama, investigators were up against a very different crime scene that left many clues, but few possible suspects. Birmingham, the state's largest metropolitan city, prides itself on its blend of modern sophistication and traditional Southern hospitality. On the morning of May 19, 1992, a landlord stopped by one of his rental properties. His plan was to repair his tenant Candace Brown's broken fence. He had just arrived when he saw glass from a broken window pane. He also noticed a cut telephone line. Concerned for the safety of the young single mother, the landlord went to the front door to check on her.
Candace!
But no one appeared to be home.
Candace!
The landlord immediately went to a neighbor's house and phoned police. When officers arrived, they discovered a 2-year-old boy sitting alone in a bedroom. But there was no sign of Candace. Afraid that she might have been the victim of a kidnapping or worse, the officers knew they had to find her as quickly as possible. Detectives and volunteers set out to search the neighborhood and the nearby woods. The K-9 unit was brought in to help find the young mother. As the search continued, Candace's house was processed for clues. Although the phone line was cut and the window was broken, there was nothing inside suggesting robbery, and no signs of visible struggle. This puzzled veteran homicide detective Steve Corvin.
Inside the home, we found very little evidence. Nothing was disturbed, the house wasn't ransacked, there didn't appear to be anything missing.
Outside, forensic investigators photographed and bagged the broken pieces of glass. The broken window was the point of entry. And there was another potential clue.
Hey, detective, I think we got something over here.
A shoe print discovered on one of the pieces of glass showed visible and distinct markings. The freshly cut phone line was also removed and taken as evidence. As investigators continued their search of the house, Candace Brown's parents arrived to take the little boy. They had no idea what could have happened to their daughter. They had just seen her the night before. Candace left her son at their house while she went out for a few hours. When she came to pick him up, she asked if they would follow her home. Her parents said that she had been nervous lately. Her home was burglarized a week earlier, and she was afraid to go into a dark house alone with her son. But after turning on the lights, she smiled and waved them off. Candace's parents told detectives their daughter was outgoing and worked as a volunteer at a church ministry. She regularly visited a local minimum security prison known as an honor farm, where she counseled residents. As officers tried contacting the ministry, Detective Corvin spoke to her neighbors. One neighbor said she saw something suspicious. She looked out the window the night before and noticed a man in an unfamiliar vehicle parked outside Candace's house. Although she didn't get a good look at the driver, she described the car as a white Honda Accord. Several hours had passed, and the searchers still had not found Candace. To get more accurate information on the shoe print found outside Candace Brown's house, the glass was sent to the State Department of Forensic Sciences lab. Forensic examiners analyzed the print to try to determine the size and make of the shoe. The pieces of the cut phone line were also examined. Technicians hoped that the particular cut in the line would help them identify the type of tool used to sever the wire. With the results still inconclusive, Detective Corvin visited the honor farm. Candace's parents gave the detective the name of an inmate that was an old friend of hers. The friend told the detective that he and Candace went to high school together.
Absolutely, absolutely. I mean, when in there is where they met.
And that Candace regularly came to the honor farm to visit him. The friend also said he introduced Candace to another resident. Michael Land came to 2 or 3 meetings with Candace and seemed interested in her ministry and her desire to help him get back on track. He went on to say that since Michael Land had been released already, he had asked him to go check up on Candace for him.
I just hope you can figure it out because...
Detective Corvin performed a background search on Land and discovered he had been in prison before. With Candace Brown still missing and time running out, detectives felt they now had a potential lead. and they set out to find Michael Land. Detectives in Birmingham, Alabama were investigating the suspicious disappearance of Candace Brown. It had been more than 2 days, and with each passing hour, the hopes of ever finding the young mother alive faded. So far, the most promising lead was a known felon named Michael Land, who Candace counseled in prison. Detective Steve Corvin tracked down Land, who was working for a local construction company.
We told him that Candace Brown was missing and we'd like to talk to him about her disappearance. We didn't say we suspected him of anything, we just thought he might be helpful.
Michael Land volunteered to go with the detective to the police station. While being tape recorded, Michael Land explained to the detective how he met Candace Brown at the Honor Farm.
I was at the Honor Farm at the time.
He said that they were introduced through a mutual friend and had developed a friendship. He also said he went to visit her after he was released.
Well, you know, we talked and we did form a friendship.
With the tape still rolling, Michael Land denied having any knowledge about Candace's whereabouts.
Well, she would come in.
On the night of her disappearance, Land claimed to have been at his girlfriend's house.
It was more really
He said that he slept in his car outside her house that night and was nowhere near Candace's.
come by and see her kid.
But at one point during the interview, the detective noticed something suspicious. While Land was talking, he crossed his legs. The print on the bottom of his shoes looked similar to the print found on the broken piece of glass. To rule out Land as a suspect, the detective asked if he could examine the rest of his clothing. As Michael Land changed into jail clothes, the detective had his story checked out. A police officer went to visit Land's girlfriend at her house. She claimed that she did not see Michael Land at all the day before, and that to her knowledge, he had not slept in his car outside her home. Land's shoes and clothes were sent to the police lab, where they were examined. The clothes provided no clues, but forensic scientist Phyllis Rowland found several stains around the toe of the tennis shoe that looked like blood.
In looking for stains and identifying them as blood stains, I will visually look at the item of evidence for primarily reddish-brown stains or stains that might look like blood, and remove a very, very small amount of those stains and use a chemical test to determine whether they give a reaction that is indicative of blood.
The blood found on the shoes was human. Detective Corvin confronted Michael Land, and Land asked the detective to turn off the tape recorder. He wanted to come clean. Land admitted to breaking into her house a week earlier, but claimed he didn't take anything. He then said that on the night of Candace's disappearance, he ran into two guys named Tony and Edward. Tony and Edward wanted to know if he knew of any easy places to rob, and Land told him about Candace's. He said that he went with them, but that the two guys started to get rough with Candace. He confessed that the blood on his shoes happened when one of the guys gave Candace a bloody nose. But after things started to get violent, he got scared and left.
He had an answer for everything until we started being able to show that there was inconsistencies with what he was telling us. Then he would make up something to cover that. He said that one of the guys slapped her to the floor and bloodied her nose. And we said, well, we didn't find any blood on the floor.
There was still some hope that Candace was alive. Investigators asked Land for the keys to his car. Not knowing what they might find, the officers got verbal authority from the district attorney to open the trunk. With Land still at the police station, the detective went to examine the car. Inside the trunk, they found a pair of wire cutters and a .45 caliber gun. But no sign of Candace. The car was impounded while they waited for an official warrant. The detective had enough to hold Michael Land for 48 hours while evidence could be processed and an arrest warrant issued. Police still didn't know what had happened to Candace, but they feared the worst.
We had come to the conclusion that she was probably dead, but we had no idea where to look. He didn't admit that he had harmed her in any way, and his only connection to it was that he was there with two men.
The very next morning, two boys had skipped school and were hiking near a quarry on Ruffner Mountain. They made a shocking discovery. Partially hidden in some trees was the body of a dead woman. Detectives were called to the scene and photographed the body. Detective Corvin recognized the body as Candace Brown. She had been shot once in the head, and there was evidence of possible sexual assault. After days of searching, detectives' worst fears were confirmed. A young mother was dead, and all the evidence seemed to point directly at Michael Land. And now, detectives needed proof. Police in Birmingham, Alabama were now investigating a homicide. The body of Candace Brown, a young mother, was found in the nearby woods. And all of the evidence pointed to Michael Land, and the detectives now needed to prove he was a killer. At autopsy, it was confirmed Candace had died as a result of a single gunshot wound to the head. The bullet was removed and sent to the ballistics lab. There was also evidence of sexual assault. Although Michael Land admitted he broke into the house, he maintained two other individuals attacked Candace. Land referred to them only as Tony and Edward. Detective Steve Corvin suspected he might be lying.
We didn't believe that these men were real to begin with. When somebody gives you a real generic name and they just met them and that sort of thing, you know that it's pretty much fictional.
Forensic examiners made a print of Land's shoes. It was then measured against the print found on the glass. They concluded there was only one perpetrator in the house, and the prints at the crime scene matched the shoes worn by Land. At the State Forensic Lab, Phyllis Rowland examined the clothing Candace was wearing to try to determine where she was murdered.
I retrieved the shirt that was identified to be from Candace Brown and looked at the bloodstain patterns that were present on it and determined that she was shot where she was found. And in doing so, looked at the back of the shirt and found biological stain there, which was actually a semen stain.
The stain was removed and tested for DNA. Using the available method of DNA fingerprinting, Phyllis Rowland was able to match the blood found on Land's shoe to Candace Brown. She also matched the semen stain to Michael Land's DNA. The only thing left to do was to confirm the .45 caliber weapon found in the trunk of Land's car was the actual gun used to murder Candace. Ballistics experts conducted tests using Land's .45. The spent bullet was checked against the one taken from Candace's body. There was a match. Armed with overwhelming evidence, Michael Land was placed under arrest.
Do you want me to tell you more? I'll tell you again. Do you want to hear again?
Detectives determined Land acted alone that night. After cutting the phone line, Michael Land broke the window and entered the house. He then kidnapped Candace Brown, leaving her 2-year-old son still sleeping.
All right. Come on. Come on.
Because the murder was committed during a kidnapping and burglary, Michael Jeffrey Land was convicted of 2 counts of capital murder and sentenced to die. When killers strike those they know, they shatter the bonds of confidence and trust. But for detectives and forensic investigators, it is often the evidence of that forsaken trust that helps bring the murderers to justice. In Northern California, a fire rages in the middle of the night. A woman's charred body is discovered in the smoldering aftermath. But how she turned up dead remains a mystery. Detectives turn to forensic science in the hopes of uncovering the answers to their many questions. When investigators start sifting through the ashes, they have no idea it will lead to a trail of deception. This is a case of out-and-out lies, and not one, but 2 cold-blooded murders. When people trust their killer with their secrets, their money, and their lives, it can very well turn out to be a tragic case of misplaced loyalty. In this episode, some of the names have been changed. The city of Berkeley, California is well known for its hippie counterculture and bohemian lifestyle. Nestled in the rolling hills just across the bridge from San Francisco, it's a magnet for people of all walks of life. Criminals can hide in plain sight, making it a perfect place to cover up an insidious crime. In the early morning hours of June 25th, 1994, a loud explosion rocked the home of James Hutchings. It was 4 in the morning, and his next-door neighbor, Virginia Bailey's house was on fire. He rushed to call the fire department, but took consolation in the knowledge that Bailey was out of town.
Yeah, there's a fire. My neighbor's house is on fire. Yes. 2912.
Do you know who lives here? Virginia Bailey? Is she at home right now? She's out of town. Okay, we're sending the fire department. We're on the way. Thank you.
Dispatchers immediately dispatched the Berkeley Fire Department to the scene. Firefighters rushed to what they thought was an unoccupied home. When they arrived, shooting flames were visible through the window. Working deliberately for several hours, the firemen extinguished the fire. Firefighters entered the house to make sure the fire was out. They noticed the majority of the damage from the blaze was in the dining room. Deputy Fire Marshal Wayne Inouye was on the scene.
When I got on the scene, I found a two-story residential dwelling. I went into the first floor, and the first floor wasn't that badly damaged. I proceeded up to the second floor, and that's where the majority of the fire damage was. There was a lot of smoke damage on the second floor, and in the dining room, there was heavy fire damage.
Hey Chuck, shine your light in there. Over to the right. What is that? Body.
It was there they made a shocking discovery. A body lying face down in the smoldering debris, clearly dead.
We've got a confirmed 8900 in this location. Notify the fire marshals. Better get the coroner started up this way.
They also noticed something odd about the scene. The room was virtually without furniture, and the body was found 6 feet from the fireplace. When firefighters discover a body, they are required to notify the coroner's office. Coroner technicians arrived on the scene. They noticed the victim had severe burns on both her head and her hands. James Hutchings was shocked to learn that his neighbor might have perished in the fire.
I heard a huge explosion. Heard an explosion?
He knew Virginia was supposed to be in Salt Lake City for a wedding. And if she were home, he wondered why her car was not in the driveway.
When you looked out the window, did you see anybody out there?
No.
Anybody running from the house?
Nope, just flames.
How about
flames? A lot of smoke.
With what they learned from the neighbor, investigators now turned to science to piece together the events that led to a tragic outcome. An autopsy was performed at the State Crime Lab in Berkeley, California. Even though Virginia Bailey was reportedly out of town, forensic experts identified the body using X-rays. The victim was Virginia Bailey. She was home at the time of the fire. But other evidence quickly deemed the exam anything but routine. Upon looking at the body, the first thing the ME noticed was severe decomposition, a finding inconsistent with the person who supposedly just died.
I think I'd like to look at the X-rays. We're going to do, we're going to stop right here.
Even more telling were maggots found in the chest cavity and on the clothing of the corpse. Maggots usually take somewhere between 24 to 48 hours to appear, and do so only on dead bodies. But there could be no logical reason they would appear on the charred body of a fire victim so soon after her death. Dr. Paul Herman of the coroner's office reviewed the autopsy results and examined the photographs.
There was something peculiar about this case because there was evidence of decomposition of the body, even to the point that there were some maggots present on the body and in the clothing, indicating that this person had died long before this fire had occurred.
Since the autopsy revealed the presence of maggots, entomologist Jeffrey Wells was brought in to help establish time of death. Due to their size, he was able to determine that Bailey died at least 3 days before she appeared to be killed in the fire.
If you estimate the age of a maggot found on a body,
This gives you a pretty good minimum time since death. The reason for this is flies almost never deposit their eggs or larvae on a live person. Almost always the person must be dead when that happens. If I can estimate the age of a maggot, that gives me a minimum time since death. For example, if I pluck a maggot off of a corpse, and I am pretty sure that it is 3 days old, almost certainly that person has been dead for at least 3 days.
Dr. Wells definitively concluded that Virginia Bailey didn't die in the fire. Investigators' worst fears were coming to light. The case was now a criminal matter, and at the Berkeley Police Department, Inspector Al Bierce was assigned the file. Things clearly didn't add up, and Bierce needed to find out what or who had killed Virginia Bailey.
If she had died naturally, it would have been impossible for this fire to have occurred as a natural outgrowth of her death. For example, if she was walking across the room with some kind of a material and then suffered a heart attack, fell, started the fire, there wasn't going to be any decomposition there.
Bierce's first move was to meet with the victim's brother, who had some questions of his own. They began to create a timeline leading up to Virginia's death.
When was the last time that you talked to her by phone?
He hadn't heard from his sister for weeks before the fire.
He always got a call from his sister on his birthday. He didn't get a call. That was totally out of character for her.
Virginia and her brother were extremely close and had recently attended a friend's wedding.
Hello there. I just want both of you to know that I love
Her
you
brother
both
believed
so
that something
much.
didn't
So
sit
happy
right about his
to
sister's
see
disappearance.
that both of you are just made for each other.
He said the two usually spoke all the time. Yet he had left messages on her answering machine and heard nothing back from her. Virginia's brother told Inspector Bierce that Christine Lloyd, Virginia's financial advisor, had been house-sitting for his sister. He also told him that some of Virginia's furniture was missing from her house.
That's all I've got for now. I know where you are down at the motel.
Inspector Bierce was faced with many questions. He was at the beginning of a complicated investigation. Bierce needed to uncover evidence to find out if someone had killed Virginia Bailey and tried to make it look like an accidental fire death.
What is that over there? You see how it goes around before starting
And
to draw
perhaps
like that?
what he was looking for was buried in the ashes of the fire. A deadly fire ravaged the home of Virginia Bailey, and investigators grew suspicious. After only a preliminary investigation, Berkeley Police Inspector Al Bierce thought he had a murder on his hands. Autopsy reports revealed the presence of maggots on a body found at the scene of the fire. Scientists conclusively proved that Virginia Bailey had already been dead for at least 3 days before the fire started. Inspector Bierce decided to visit the scene of the crime firsthand. When he arrived, the fire investigator pointed out burn patterns.
There's no charring on the wood or anything, so it leads to believe that it didn't start here at the fireplace.
Things did not add up.
So this will be real important that we get this done.
They noticed evidence of pore patterns near the body.
Did we come in with a sniffer that night?
This would indicate the presence of an accelerant.
It was poured over the body.
And perhaps the most telling sign, the body was discovered over 6 feet from the fireplace.
I'm seeing it right here.
Right
If the fire began in the fireplace, there should be burn marks that led to the body. There were none. The area directly surrounding the body was suspiciously intact. The investigator believed this was arson. He hoped those closest to Virginia could provide him with information as to how and why she died in the fire.
I had something I wanted to
to talk to you
He
about
asked
something.
Christine Lloyd, the victim's financial advisor and best friend, to meet him there.
One thing from the other day when we
She
talked
was house
about
sitting for Virginia.
how you were coming into the house. You said you came in through any irregularities.
When
in this
Christine
area?
Lloyd arrived, she told Inspector Bierce she and Virginia were close friends, and she had been her financial advisor for about 10 years.
Everything seemed normal.
Okay.
But there was something else that I needed to
Christine was watching the house while Virginia was in San Francisco the week before the fire.
It was pretty much in place at the time.
But she said she never saw Virginia's body in the dining room.
There was something else that I needed to show.
Christine said she went back to the house right after the fire. She and a friend were there trying to rescue Virginia's items from the burned house. It was then they saw something in the downstairs apartment that Virginia usually rented. Christine said this was unusual because the apartment was vacant. She showed Bierce what she had found in the downstairs rental unit. Christine said she was worried that someone had been staying downstairs.
Before the fire.
She told the detective she noticed something disturbing about the condition of the rental apartment's refrigerator.
Oh my God.
Whoa.
How did this happen?
Christine Lloyd pointed out the refrigerator, and she said that just a week before, it had been totally clean and the shelves had been inside. When she showed it to me, the shelves were out of it, and there was a residue on the bottom of the refrigerator, suggestive of the fact that something had been stored there. And she was telling me that nothing had been stored there the last time she had seen it. How many days before the fire were you here?
I was here a couple of days ago.
In the bedroom, Bierce found a terrible mess.
Looks like somebody's been living in here.
There was a mattress on the floor and bottles strewn everywhere.
Look in here. Look at this.
The uninvited resident had left the apartment in disarray. The refrigerator contained what appeared to be a dark liquid residue that looked like blood. To determine what it was, crime technicians performed a luminol test. Also in the refrigerator, what appeared to be a small clump of hair riddled with maggots. Inspector Bierce had the technician remove the hair clump and take a swabbing of the red liquid.
Swab that liquid.
The samples were sent to the lab for further examination. But it was quickly determined that the substance wasn't blood and the hair did not belong to Virginia. And Bierce made another unusual discovery.
Okay.
The smoke detector for the downstairs unit had been unplugged.
Okay.
Get started. This looks pretty staged.
Oh, yeah. I went into that room with a very skeptical eye, and it looked staged. That was put there so that somebody would think that somebody had been crashing there, and potentially the person who was crashing there was the person who'd gone upstairs and killed the victim.
Bierce's suspicions continued to grow. Little things about the scene troubled him, like how unusually neat, strategic, and organized the squatter's mess seemed. That despite all the bottles strewn about, there were no bottle caps. There were also no fingerprints on the bottles. To him, the whole scene felt manufactured. Jeffrey Wells examined the hair found in the refrigerator for the presence of maggots. The maggots he found were alive. Types of maggots vary. Those found in the downstairs refrigerator were scuttlefly maggots, different from the flesh fly maggots found on Virginia Bailey's body. The ones in the apartment were insects attracted to rotting food, as well as human remains. All this information troubled Inspector Bierce. But perhaps the most puzzling was the fact that Christine Lloyd said she hadn't seen Virginia's body. After all, she had been dead for at least 3 days. If the body was in the refrigerator, that would support Christine's story. But the science wasn't adding up. If the body was not hidden in the refrigerator, where had it been?
I'm saying, okay, some part of this doesn't make any sense. Either she's aware that the body is there and has played some role in the body being there, or somebody is coming in after the fact and planted the body there. It's not going to make a great deal of sense to me.
Inspector Bierce was beginning to think Christine Lloyd knew more. Perhaps she could shed more light on Virginia's whereabouts before the fire started. He decided to look a little harder at Christine's story. Virginia Bailey was found dead in her Berkeley, California home, and the circumstances surrounding her death were suspicious. The presence of maggots on the body proved she had been dead for some time before the fire. And the story told by the victim's friend, Christine Lloyd, was not adding up.
Come on in, Inspector.
It looked as if Inspector Al Bierce was piecing together a murder.
So how can I help you?
Well, as we talked
The
about
detective met with her to ask her some follow-up questions.
To find out what I can about her habits. She put herself in the house every single day. She put herself into the house as late as 14 hours before the fire. I've got a coroner who's telling me, or who has told me, that the victim's dead for at least 2 days. She's found in an area where Christine Lloyd would have had to have passed through the room within feet of the body to feed the cats and to get the mail. I'm going to leave my card.
It seemed unlikely to Bierce that Virginia could have died of natural causes and lay there for days before the fire ignited.
You can call me or have them call me.
It was time to do some legwork, to learn more about the victim. Bierce began questioning friends and business associates of Virginia's. He started with her co-worker, Mary Cates, who said Virginia wasn't scheduled to go to San Francisco, as Christine had said. Mary also told Inspector Bierce that Virginia had been missing work lately.
Very much out of character, no.
Since this was completely out of character, she said she called Virginia to make sure she was okay. She left a message on her answering machine, but never received a call back from Virginia.
She informed me that...
But said Christine Lloyd called her to tell her Virginia was out of town.
I believe she was at school.
Bierce spoke to several of Virginia's friends, and they all had the same story. When they would call Virginia, they'd get a call back from Christine Lloyd.
Good.
Since Bierce determined Virginia had many friends who were concerned about her whereabouts, he found it odd that no one had actually been able to reach her in the days prior to the fire.
She had missed appointments on the 17th, 18th, and 19th?
Yes, correct.
One friend, Alicia Jackson, was so concerned she headed over to her house to make sure she was okay. But there was no answer. Only a note on the door saying she was in San Francisco. She thought this was odd, but left her own note, hoping to hear back from her missing friend.
We're obviously
Bierce was puzzled.
Hearing from anybody we can.
Although all her friends were being helpful, no one offered anything that gave the investigation focus.
Okay.
Okay, thank you.
Okay, thank you for coming.
Virginia's brother came back to the police station and offered up a charred piece of evidence. It was Virginia's answering machine, presumably full of messages from concerned friends.
Fire damage to the cassette, pretty well warped.
Inspector Bierce sent the tape to the DOJ crime lab in the hopes of salvaging the burned cassette.
Not sure what we're going to be able to get out.
Perhaps the messages on the machine would lead to answers as to why every time someone tried to make contact with Virginia, they made contact with Christine Lloyd instead.
Be in touch with what we do.
Bierce ran a background check on Christine Lloyd. She came up clean, except for a minor traffic violation. Since Christine was Virginia's financial advisor, Inspector Bierce decided to get a warrant to examine the victim's financial records.
Come on in. Have a seat.
Bierce went to Virginia's bank for answers. Years of experience taught Bierce, study a victim's finances and you'll likely uncover a motive. Virginia's bank activity had reached a fever pitch in the weeks before her death. Large checks were written against Virginia's account, not only to Christine, but also to a woman named Myrtle Lloyd.
About 50% of the proceeds of that account went to Christine Lloyd.
One peculiar thing Bierce noted was a certified foreclosure letter dated the 13th of June. Christine was responsible for making sure all of the bills were paid on time.
Certified mail.
And she had given him no indication that Virginia was in such severe financial trouble.
Card when she opened the bank.
And another red flag. Something that made no sense for a woman who was in dire financial straits and about to lose her home. A flurry of checks written in June. The end of a 6-month spending spree totaling thousands of dollars. In total, 4 checks were made out to Christine and Myrtle Lloyd. Some dated after Virginia's death. Bierce believed he found a motive: embezzlement. Now he needed some kind of smoking gun. Bierce asked Virginia's manager for ATM surveillance tapes at Virginia's bank.
More checks to draw. I will get back to you with.
He also pored over every financial document he could find.
Yeah. Do we have one for bleach and?
And there, among the detailed receipts from Virginia's account, came a startling discovery.
One for 2136.
Inspector Bierce found receipts for both an accelerant and a garden hose.
Given the date of that purchase and the fact that an accelerant was very possibly used in the ignition of the fire, it provided a nexus between that purchase and the fact that the fire had occurred.
It looked as if Christine had been using Virginia's account. And the purchase of 2 40-ounce cans of lighter fluid and a hose on her account just days before the fire was quickly turning friend into suspect.
Oh, we can put it.
Can you hook it up?
Yeah.
Bierce's next step was to watch the surveillance video provided by Virginia's bank.
Have you queued this up already?
Yeah, this is already queued up.
It contained no surprise. Clear as day, there was Christine Lloyd signing Virginia's checks and deposit slips on checks made out to herself. The checks were in the exact amount of Virginia's missing mortgage payments. One of the checks was dated 3 days before Virginia's death. Yet it was cashed 3 days after her death. It was made out to Myrtle Lloyd. Bierce needed to know who this woman was and if she and Christine were working together to steal Virginia's money. Since their last names were the same, he presumed the two were related. Bierce did a records check on Myrtle Lloyd. What he found out was perhaps the most disturbing thing yet in this perplexing case. Myrtle Lloyd was Christine's mother, and Myrtle Lloyd was dead. It appeared that Christine was not only signing checks on Virginia's account for herself, she was also signing checks made out to a dead woman, her own mother. Bierce visited with the Oakland police, who looked into Myrtle Lloyd's death. He wanted details. Captain Ralph Lacer of the Oakland Police Department remembered her story. He told Bierce that Myrtle had been found dead in her bathtub with severe bruises to her face and lacerations to her head.
And she was doing some financial things for her, and it's looking right now like she was taking...
Because there were no obvious signs of foul play, and police believed Christine's story, the coroner ruled Myrtle's death an accident.
After finding no sign of forced entry in the residence, there was no loss in the residence, or no one appeared to have kind of rummaged through the residence, it came out that we didn't see anything that showed it was a hands of another, and at this point they ruled that it was an accidental death.
Maybe would have come across as an accidental death, but knowing what I
Then Bierce learned that Christine Lloyd had found her mother's body.
That she had seen the mother the day before, and that she had left and done some shopping, and then she was bringing some groceries back to the house.
According to the July 1991 police reports, Christine Lloyd said she returned home from the grocery store.
Hello? What's the groceries for you?
She was surprised when her mom was nowhere to be found. It was when she entered the bathroom that she made the startling discovery of her mother's body. Then, things just clicked for the detective. He instinctively knew he had a second murder on his hands. And he was determined to get the evidence necessary to prove it. While investigating the death of Virginia Bailey,
that was my first impression.
Inspector Al Bierce believed he had uncovered another murder. And he was convinced the same killer committed both crimes. The woman who had been so helpful from the beginning was now a suspect.
At that point in the investigation, I knew that she'd killed my victim in Berkeley, and I knew that she had killed her mother 3 years before. And I knew that she had done a very good job of concealing that death 3 years ago to make it look like an accidental death, not murder.
He was beginning to put it all together, but there were still some unanswered questions. Bierce went to the Oakland coroner's office to find out more.
And what I found...
Dr. Paul Herman performed the autopsy on Myrtle Lloyd.
When I walked in the bathroom, I would have expected to find a great deal of blood spattered about in the bathroom because of these injuries to the head.
This was not what he thought he'd find. After all, the victim had severe head wounds. There should have been blood everywhere. But then Dr. Herman saw the smallest of clues. He also noticed more signs that the scene had been meticulously cleaned.
This bathroom was clean. The water had been drained from the tub, and there was some debris from decomposition and probably blood at the bottom of the tub, but no spattering of blood around there at all. And that's what I would have expected to see. And expose the bone. But there are
Myrtle Lloyd was killed by 7 separate lacerations to the back of her head. Christine explained that her mother was prone to seizures and said that she had fallen in the bathtub.
And in addition, she had a laceration of her forehead.
Bierce knew things were not adding up. And after visiting Oakland, his suspicions about Christine escalated. He believed the crime scene was too neat, almost in direct contrast to the scene in Berkeley.
Yeah, they're on both sides, and some of
but both appeared staged nonetheless.
They're crosswise across the back of the head.
To test their suspicions, investigators spoke with Myrtle Lloyd's doctors to determine if she had been ill or had any known conditions that would make her unsteady on her feet.
Physical exams.
What they found out would break the cold case wide open. Myrtle was in excellent health and had no history of seizures. By now, Detective Bierce was convinced of Christine Lloyd's guilt. He was ready to make an arrest. What he needed was a charge. At this point, there was not enough direct evidence to make a murder arrest. since Christine had signed Virginia Bailey's name on checks. His best bet was forgery. He turned to handwriting expert Verl Truman, a forensic document examiner with the U.S. Postal Inspection Service, and asked him to look at the checks for fraud.
Handwriting examination is basically a side-by-side comparison. The basis for the identification of handwriting is the fact that no two persons share the same combination of individual identifying handwriting characteristics. We look for various features and habits of the writer. We look for the way the person makes beginning strokes, ending strokes, or connecting strokes between letters and letter combinations. We look at things such as the relative height ratio and proportion of letters and in relation to other letters.
He found subtle differences between their handwriting styles, which Truman said were patterns and traits that every individual develops over the years.
Now, these characteristics, it's very difficult to cast off your habits when you're either imitating the handwriting of another person or if you're trying to disguise your own writing. Usually some of your habits will still show through.
And Christine was unable to completely disguise hers.
Hi, Al. Understand you got something for me? Yes, I
But
believe I
perhaps
do.
the most telling sign was not an actual letter or a word,
Notice that she makes a star
but a
formation
unique
dollar
and
sign.
personal signature symbol.
And on this one, which I believe is Virginia Bailey used a star as a dollar sign in her writing, and she constructed that character beginning and ending at the lower left corner or 7 o'clock position. Christine Lloyd, on the other hand, did it completely opposite. She began it and started it at the lower right. That was a feature that she just happened to miss.
Inspector Bierce now had proof of forgery, but what he needed was proof of murder. Bierce decided to take another look at the days prior to the fire. Christine was the only one with Virginia's house key, and the only one who seemed to know anything about Virginia's whereabouts. She had even been returning Virginia's phone messages. At the State Crime Lab, technicians worked to restore the message tape from Virginia Bailey's answering machine.
Stick around. I'll play this.
Investigators were now able to retrieve the messages, although they had no idea what they'd find. By comparing the phone records to the voice messages, Inspector Bierce was able to piece together the chain of events leading up to and following Virginia's murder.
Hey, Virginia, it's me. I haven't heard from you in a while. Where are you? Call me.
The calls reflected a growing concern about Virginia's disappearance on June 13th, 12 days before the fire. And oddly, many of the outgoing calls Bierce found on Virginia's phone records began on that very day.
There was information that came to me during the course of the investigation that suggested that the victim had died on June 13th. That was the last time anybody ever talked to her, and it was the time through phone records that I showed that she had made a call to Christine.
The pieces were falling into place. Bierce felt he was close to being able to make an arrest. He paid a visit to another one of Virginia's neighbors, Sam Watson.
Al Biersberg, PD.
Watson told of helping Christine carry a large dining room table, as well as other items, from Virginia's house before the fire. She then sold them at a yard sale.
You selling this table too?
Christine had denied having any idea what had happened to that table.
Hello.
Hi, how are you? Good.
I guess it was about 2 days before.
Every part of Christine Lloyd's story seemed suspect. In investigators believed she was in a frenzy of greed, intent on fully taking over her friend's assets through any means possible.
Calm down on the ground. Calm down. Step towards me, ma'am. Step towards me. Keep walking. Need you to stop. Turn around with your back towards me. Face the house. Face the house.
In early December of 1994, Inspector Al Bierce arrested Christine Lloyd for murder and took her into custody.
Take you over to the car. We'll put you in the car. Do you have any weapons? Do you have knives, guns?
Bierce was convinced that Christine Lloyd had masterminded 2 murders.
That Christine?
But he only had enough evidence to bring her in for the murder of Virginia Bailey. He believed she was motivated by money and greed.
You have the right to remain silent. Anything
And he
you say
wanted to see
can and
Christine Lloyd behind bars.
You have the right to an attorney. To have that attorney
Christine
present
Lloyd
when you
refused to
question.
speak to police.
You can't afford to
She refused to take a polygraph test.
charge. You understand those rights as I
Instead, she asked for her attorney. She was processed into the system. Although Christine Lloyd was sticking to her guns regarding Virginia Bailey, when asked about her mother, she shook her head and told Bierce he was wrong. She said she was a loving daughter who doted on her mother and would never do anything to harm her. Apparently, Christine Lloyd was convincing. At the time of the arrest, the district attorney's office didn't feel comfortable going ahead and prosecuting the case.
What's your name? Christine.
They didn't feel the evidence was strong enough to get a conviction. Her immediate release was ordered.
Please check and make sure everything is there.
As she walked out of the jail, Inspector Al Bierce despaired.
I knew that she had embezzled from her mother, leading up to the murder of her mother. I knew that she had embezzled from my victim, leading to her murder. And from a personal standpoint, that wasn't something I could let go of.
Convinced he was dealing with a murderer who had already killed twice, Inspector Bierce wasn't about to let it rest.
Yes, you are.
He needed more evidence. He turned to forensic scientists to help him bring this killer to justice. Berkeley County investigator Al Bierce pieced together a story of greed, lies, and murder. He was convinced Christine Lloyd killed both her best friend and her own mother. Now, despite nearly a year on the case, hundreds of hours of legwork and compelling evidence,
Please check and make sure.
he was watching her go free.
Yes, you are.
I knew she was guilty, and I couldn't let go.
Good night, guys. Night, Glenn.
Al Bierce was now working all hours, trying to plug any holes in what he thought was an airtight case against Christine Lloyd.
Right out, let's go.
The district attorney's office refused to prosecute the case, stating the evidence was circumstantial and it would not hold up in court. But Al Bierce had worked too hard to let this one slip through his fingers.
By the time I got through, when I was at that point in the investigation, I knew that she'd killed my victim in Berkeley, and I knew that she had killed her mother 3 years before. And I knew that she had done a very good job of concealing that death 3 years ago to make it look like an accidental death, not murder.
Bierce approached Thomas Rogers, the head of the trial staff at the DA's office in Alameda County. After hearing the details of Bierce's investigation, he too became determined to bring the case to justice.
I made a commitment that I was going to try the case. In our business, many of the cases are much more interesting than what we see on television. There's a tremendous human drama involved. For anybody who's curious, you have a woman who's 55 years old with no record. Why did she kill her best friend?
This was the question puzzling investigators for over a year.
Hello, Al. Tom Rogers.
But as Bierce and Rogers discovered, it all came down to money.
When he went through the receipts, you should do that.
Christine Lloyd had been cashing her mother's civil service pension checks. And the men believed that once Virginia Bailey confronted Christine about the house foreclosure, it was only a matter of time before authorities began looking into Christine's finances and found out about Myrtle Lloyd. But despite all the circumstantial evidence, the clear motive of embezzlement, and the testimony of the handwriting analyst, it would be a tough case to try. There was no cause of death, no eyewitnesses, no smoking gun. D.A. Rogers decided to take one last look at the pile of evidence Inspector Bierce had uncovered. After weeks of combing through the findings, he was convinced. The final link to justice and punishment would come down to a tiny piece of living evidence.
The most compelling evidence was the entomology evidence. If we did not have the entomology evidence, we never would have been able to prove the case.
The fact that maggots will only feed on a dead body was the only piece of conclusive proof that Virginia was dead long before the fire. But it was the proof that made Rogers feel comfortable enough to try the case. And it was the one hole in Christine Lloyd's story which all the other lies would come rushing through. She placed herself in the house during the time of Virginia's death and the time of the fire. This would be the crux of the prosecutor's case. That Christine Lloyd had committed Virginia Bailey's murder and spent 2 weeks manufacturing an elaborate crime scene to cover her tracks. In July of 1995, 1 year after the fire that killed her best friend, Virginia Bailey, Christine Lloyd was once again arrested.
Are there any weapons?
Right to remain silent.
But this time, she was headed to trial. Once again, Lloyd refused to speak to the man who had made it his mission to put her behind bars.
You're getting one more chance at your side of the story. It's a pretty quiet trip coming in.
But by now, Bierce and D.A. Rogers had fully patched together what had happened to Virginia Bailey and the events leading up to her murder.
Assuming you're not going to be talking to me.
Near trial, we re-investigated and were able to prove through statements and circumstantial evidence that clearly Christine Lloyd had killed her mother. And that the motive then for killing Virginia Bailey was to avoid a re-examination of the mother's death.
Virginia Bailey had no idea her dear friend Christine Lloyd had been embezzling from her. So when she came home on the afternoon of June 13th, 1994, to find a registered foreclosure note from her bank, Virginia was undoubtedly surprised and angry.
She panicked. She phoned Christine and she said, you know, you're my financial advisor. What is the deal here? There was a 3.5-minute call to Christine's house in Martinez.
At that point, Christine knew she was caught, and it wouldn't be long before everyone knew the deadly secrets she had been hiding for 3 years. She showed up at the house intent on murder.
The bank, they're foreclosing on the house. They wrote the checks out in paper.
Using a blunt object, she brutally struck Virginia until she was dead. It would now be up to a jury to determine if Christine Lloyd was the murderous woman Al Bierce was convinced she was. But Al Bierce also wanted justice for Myrtle Lloyd and uncovered that Christine was the sole beneficiary of a $100,000 life insurance policy. So as Christine sat in jail awaiting trial for one murder, the investigation continued on the second. This was enough to indict once again for murder. Driven by the same greed, Christine had inflicted a beating on her elderly mother. Christine Lloyd was convicted of 2 counts of first-degree murder and 1 count of arson. She received 2 consecutive life sentences. In planning, executing, and covering up their crimes, sometimes murderers think too much. Sometimes it is this over-planning that leads investigators to their front doors. And as long as those investigators are listening for clues, they'll have the forensic resources to back up their hunches. And clever killers will continue to be brought to justice.